Hello, welcome to Baltic World, the premier channel discussing news and important issues facing Northern, Central and Eastern Europe. My name is Crispin and I've got an important announcement out of the United Kingdom where the British are planning to double the amount of troops they have deployed in Estonia. There is a lot to say about this. I'll go through an interesting article in ERR, an Estonian outlet, and provide my analysis. There are multiple aspects to this, both in terms of the military balance in Eastern Europe, but also domestic politics in the UK and British grand strategy around the world. If you find value in this discussion, please like and subscribe. It helps grow the channel a ton. And if you wish to, you can support us on Patreon. We have big plans for Baltic World this year and a lot of rewards, including for Patreon supporters. So the article I have is titled UK Considering Sending 900 More Soldiers to Estonia, which is actually, before I get into it, a huge increase. Note that only 7,000 troops make up the standing army of Estonia, half of which are conscripts. So if you go from 900 to 1,800 UK troops, that's like 20% of the entire armed forces of Estonia. It's a significant additional capability. Anyway, it says UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson is considering sending 900 more troops to Estonia, which would double the size of the current contingent, the Financial Times newspaper reported on Saturday. The UK government said Johnson was considering the biggest possible offer in order to protect NATO allies in Eastern Europe as tensions rise with Russia on Ukraine's eastern border. Britain could send jets, warships, and military specialists to NATO allies in the region in coming days, the Financial Times said. British officials will discuss the potential offer with NATO next week in Brussels. Johnson is planning a visit to the region in February, sources said. We'll definitely cover that. One European official told the paper increasing NATO forces on the eastern flank is a purely defensive mechanism to reassure NATO allies rather than a direct threat to Putin's Russia. They said they don't compare with the current build-up by Russia. Writing in the Telegraph newspaper on Sunday, UK Foreign Secretary Liz Truss confirmed more British troops would be offered to Estonia. The UK will also provide more air support across the Black Sea and supply defensive weapons to Ukraine. Prime Minister Kayakalas confirmed Estonia is in discussions to host more UK soldiers on Sunday. Speaking to Times Radio, she said two countries' foreign ministers are now in constant communication, but stopped short of putting an exact number on how many additional soldiers may be sent to Estonia. Quote, "If the UK decides to do something, we are very, very happy to accept more troops here," she said. Kallas also denied European countries are split on the issues of how to respond to Russia. I'll leave a link to that interview below. It's also on YouTube. The interviewer, Katie Balls, I'm familiar with her work through The Spectator. It's like a conservative outlet in the UK. And Kayakalas is a very difficult person not to like. One of the things about smaller countries and their leadership, they can tend to talk honestly about subjects and in great depth. If you are dealing with complex alliances and multiple constituencies of hundreds of millions of people within your own country, like a US president or even a British Prime Minister, then you have to be very coy about what you say. Whereas this interview goes into considerable depth about how Kaya sees the world and how the Estonian Prime Minister views Estonia's best interests in that context. So I do recommend that interview. It doesn't seem like it's got many views, so it would be good to see that boosted, and good to see Kayakalas talking in depth about Estonia's security situation. I personally really appreciated it. Anyway, Kallas and President Ala Karis have called for NATO to increase its presence in Estonia and the Baltic states in recent weeks. The UK already has 830 soldiers stationed at Tapa military base as part of NATO's enhanced forward presence, and the country leads Estonia's battle group. Additionally, 150 soldiers are part of Poland's battle group. NATO members Denmark and the Netherlands have already increased their presence in the eastern flank, and France and Spain are preparing to do so. So that's the whole article. And as I said, there is an interview with the Prime Minister of Estonia, Kayakalas, in the description below. I would recommend going and checking that out. It's a good interview. She really paints the picture of how she sees Ukraine, Putin, Estonia, the UK, the current NATO relationship, Germany, All very important and pertinent subjects. So why is the UK doing this now? Well, of course, a large part of it is Putin and Ukraine. The UK wants to send a strong message to Vladimir Putin that just because he can push his way into a non-NATO country in Europe's eastern periphery, that does not mean that Russia is going to be able to push into NATO itself, or that the solidarity among the NATO allies will crumble. Far from it. The British are increasing their support for the Baltic states, including Estonia. And Liz Truss, the UK Foreign Secretary, is somewhat of a Baltic groupie. She has hosted the foreign ministers of all the Baltic countries herself in the UK as part of a state visit recently. She has got a marvelous picture of a tank where she is in Estonia, riding around with the British troops there. She is a bit like me. She actually really loves the Baltic countries, and I think it's personal for her. She doesn't want to see the major powers, such as Russia, throwing their weight around when it comes to Baltic states and their security. Also, Liz Truss, domestically in the UK, is slowly accumulating power. Boris Johnson is not the most popular Prime Minister right now. The whole COVID debacle, in which they had multiple parties at number 10 when the entire rest of the country was in lockdown, has destroyed his popularity and credibility at home, particularly when you see the image of Queen Elizabeth herself sitting there by herself, mourning her husband of 75 years, abiding by the COVID restrictions. Well, the day before, there was a party at number 10 Downing Street. So Boris Johnson his name is dirt in the UK at the moment. You have the Red Wall, so-called, the people that he won over in the traditional Labour seats. They're patriotic Britons. They supported, for example, Brexit. Of course, Boris Johnson was the face of Brexit. And they would never dream of voting Tory normally. He won them over, but he's lost them already. They are disgusted with the Prime Minister because they're very pro-monarchy, pro-Britain, and Boris has continuously shown himself to be weak on these issues. Also, despite having a massive majority of 80-plus Conservative seats in the House of Commons, there is a broad sense that they haven't been able to control the border. There is a significant number of crossings across the English Channel. Immigration is still running at over 700,000 per year. This goes totally against what the people expected when they voted for Brexit, and certainly for when they voted for Boris Johnson. So for a whole range of reasons, Boris Johnson's political capital has been spent. Liz Truss is loved by the traditional Conservative voters, and she has a kind of earthy, every person appeal that still has a lot of currency in the Red Wall. And she is standing up for traditional British values when it comes to her image in the electorate. Her star is rising, and if Boris Johnson gets knocked over, one of the key figures that potentially could replace Boris Johnson as the British Prime Minister is Liz Truss herself. And so part of her going to the eastern flank of NATO, going to the Ukraine, these things are to promote her image at home, to make sure that the Foreign Secretary isn't forgotten about by the British public doing Foreign Secretary stuff, but actually things that will get media attention at home in the United Kingdom. Increasing military deployments to the UK is one of those things. It's also likely to be one of the conditions that Liz Truss has given to the Prime Minister for her strong continued support of his prime ministership. That is, to allow her to take the lead when it comes to military affairs in Eastern NATO, to strongly support the military deployments in the Baltic states, and no doubt she would have been influential in convincing Boris Johnson to go on this upcoming trip to the Baltic states in February. So there is a lot of political maneuvering at home, of which these military deployments are a part. But there is a much more important, grand strategic reason why the United Kingdom is going in this direction. You have to understand that Britain sees itself as having a quote-unquote special relationship with the United States. Ever since the 19th century, the United Kingdom has claimed to be America's strongest ally, certainly in Europe. It was true ever since the end of the American Civil War. After the First World War, when Britain was no longer the global superpower that it had been previously, it ceded that role to America fairly gracefully. And then after the Second World War, of course, it was a bipolar world order between the United States and the Soviet Union, wherein Britain was the anchor of forward military presence in Europe, the closest ally of the United States. You had NATO, you had MI6, all of these big things where the UK were the junior partner in a strong pro-democracy coalition to face down the Soviet Union. And because the epicenter of strategic space was West and East Germany, Britain had a front row seat. Whereas now, with the rise of China, America's strategic interests are firmly in East Asia. That is Japan, Australia, the Philippines, and Britain has suddenly become a strategic backwater. Even NATO has expanded right to the Russian border, a long way away from British territory, meaning that Sweden and Poland, these countries are far more important now strategically than Britain is today. Add to that Brexit and Britain's diminished role within Europe. Well, in order for the UK to continue to gain the privileged access at the highest levels of American politics, for it to continue to get the attention that would be characteristic of a special relationship in Washington, well, they need to demonstrate that they add value to American foreign policy goals abroad. Now, most importantly, is America being able to focus on East Asia. Now, part of that can be seen in the AUKUS arrangements, where Britain and the United States are working together to provide Australia with nuclear-powered submarines, anchoring and supporting America's position in the Pacific. But that's backed up through other means as well: military technologies, AI, cyber technologies. These things are being upgraded so that America can fight a war effectively over Taiwan, a war that America sees on the horizon as something that, if not inevitable, must be prepared for over the coming decade. But more than that, Britain needs to step up to protect the eastern flank of NATO so that America isn't constantly distracted. Biden, for better or worse, is keeping America's military commitments to Ukraine at the minimal possible level. That is, it will respond economically, politically, with sanctions against any aggression with Ukraine. But Biden has made it clear that there won't be troops sent to Ukraine. Britain won't do that either, but there will be a significant increase in military deployments to Eastern NATO. So the US will contribute an extra 8,500 troops should Putin invade Ukraine to the Baltic countries, but the permanent presence, the biggest presence, has to come from the United Kingdom. So the US is now relying on London to play a leadership role in Europe and NATO security, allowing America to focus on the China challenge in the Asia Pacific, particularly so since France and especially Germany don't seem to be stepping up. So if the UK can take the lead in the 21st century, as opposed to supporting America like they did in the 20th century, then their role and importance in American grand strategy will remain high level and critical, because it means that America won't be constantly distracted when it comes to issues that flare up in Europe. And then when something bad happens in Europe, like Russian aggression towards NATO or the Baltic countries, well, these countries can turn to the UK as the first point of call to provide a leadership and coalition role. And then if the UK needs, they can go to the US and say, we need additional support and backup. And then finally, there is the domestic political picture in the United States, which I think for many years to come will limit any military deployments to Eastern NATO. There's a couple of major constituencies. First, the ascendant political class in America now, particularly in the strategists at the Pentagon, are focused on the return of great power competition, particularly with China, like I mentioned. They want to focus on maritime power, projecting power over 10,000 kilometers Pacific Ocean, long-range bombers, hypersonic missiles, all those kinds of things that aren't really relevant as a deterrent being placed in the far east of NATO. And then finally, there are the Trump nationalist realists, who are a very powerful force in American politics today. I think they will return to office the way things are going in 2024, and they are scathing about American foreign policy adventures over the past 25 years. So the Iraq War, Libya, Syria, they've all been disasters, and they have been disasters. And they think that every single time America tries to do something in some foreign country, it costs a fortune, both in lives and treasure, but also means that domestic problems at home are left unattended. So they don't want to have this focus in Europe, but they are strongly anti-China. And one of the most unifying things across party lines, Democrat and Republican, liberal, conservative, progressive, and evangelical, is an anti-China stance. So that is a unifying message within the United States in an environment where there aren't that many things that unify the country. So there is a lot of political capital in focusing on China as the great enemy and limiting foreign interventions abroad. So any American leader that emerges in the United States over the next 5 to 10 years will turn to the United Kingdom to take more of a leadership role, with them in a subordinate supporting role, ensuring that they can focus on the main game, which is China. So what we're seeing in Eastern Europe at the moment, with Poland, with the Nordic countries, with the Baltic states, is that they are deepening their bilateral ties with the United Kingdom. They're creating kind of a mini NATO within NATO. So it's Poland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, cooperation with Sweden, cooperation with Denmark, cooperation with Finland. It's a very interesting development to see. And notably, up to 20% of the troops in Estonia could be flying the Union Jack in short order. When I go and visit Estonia, I'll definitely want to go and see the British troops that are stationed there, particularly if there's been an increase before I arrive. I would love to report on that. But what do you think? Do you think this is all for show? Do you think the British have staying power in the Baltic states? Do you think this represents an upgrading and warming relationship between the Anglos and the Baltics? I would love to hear your thoughts on this. What are your views of Britain? Are you positive about Britain, negative about Britain? I would love to just hear what particularly the people in the Baltic states think of the British. I'm Australian, so I'm not going to be offended. And thank you very much. I will see you next time. Goodbye.